Okay, so this is the red thread, the red room. So if you're expecting widening access or pedagogy and assessment, those are the other two rooms, and you'll find the links to that in your emails. Okie doke. So I'm Jennifer Sizer, often referred to as Jen, and I'm here today to talk about my EdD project, which is talking about analysing multimodal text by architecture students. So for people unfamiliar with, oh, why didn't that move? Aha, I've got it. With the work I've done so far, and I know I've recognised quite a lot of faces and talked about this a little bit already. I was given in my previous EAP context a cohort of architecture students. I wasn't sure what to do with them. I knew I wanted to move away from kind of English for general academic purposes, so EGAP, to more ESAP, so English for specific academic purposes, but I wasn't really sure where to start. There weren't any textbooks for architecture students for EAP, and there wasn't much for me to kind of go on. Also, I was very aware that I kind of wanted to inhabit this space, which was the ESAP, ESOP area, because as well as architecture being an academic discipline, it's also a occupation in its own right. So actually there's a lot of academic stuff, but a lot of occupational stuff within that. So I started on this journey of trying to find out more about it in order to develop materials for this particular cohort. So I kind of started with developing a better working relationship with the architecture department, so observing some of their practices, so that's some of their pedagogical practices as well as assessment practices. So I got to observe some of their studios, some of their crits, so that's their critical review, where students have to stand up and deliver a presentation about their work. Also interviews, which were part of one of their assessments, but this was more kind of cooperation and not really collaboration. I also got to attend lots of staff meetings and that kind of thing. So I was developing an idea about those practices. I also kind of needed to extend my network and knowledge and experience from other people who are working with architects and art-based students, and that's where we set up the Creative Disciplines SIG. So if you've not heard of that already and you find that interesting, have a look at the website. I also want to give a plug to all the other SIGs that are available, because there are a lot now. So have a look at the Barleap website if you're interested in the special interest groups. And also then developing a bit of familiarity with that context in particular. So at Barleap at Leeds, I did an unobtrusive textography of a university building as part of that. So this was all kind of part of my taught phase of my EdD, then going into the research phase, which I've been working on for quite some time now. The research phase is an approach which brings together textual analysis and ethnography in what Swales called for the first time textography. You'll hear me talking about textography quite a bit, and I've kind of previously published on it, but mainly it's kind of not just the text that I'm looking at, but also the audience, being the academics, and so the lecturers within the architecture department, and the authors, so the students themselves. So as part of this work, I'm going to go further than just the text and interview them both, and interview the students in particular about their textual histories and their practices and their context. So you can kind of see here that that kind of practice and context is kind of coming out within this little triangle of practice, text and context. Okay, so that's a little bit about the kind of background and context of it. I'll move on then to talking about the text a little bit. Um, so as I mentioned, I was collecting the whole textual history of those students. So that was the whole 3 years, every text that they submitted. So even drafts, final, their feedback, everything, collected all of those texts. Also collected all the texts that were on their virtual learning environments. So some of their lecture slides, their recommended reading lists, all this sort of thing, to develop more of a sense of what these texts were, and what happens with them. I did some reading beforehand, and I've used some of these quotes in previous presentations, but I kind of found it interesting that a lot of what I found in the literature seemed to bear fruit in this text collection. So this kind of architects generally dislike writing. There weren't a lot of writing based totally writing-based assessments, and many of the texts, and I've put here, they weren't texty enough. Actually, they weren't long enough, so they didn't go kind of beyond more sentence level. So there wasn't a paragraph because there was so much kind of multimodality happening, which didn't give me a lot to analyze in terms of language. So quite a few of those texts had to be excluded from the research. Also, because of that EOPs, that occupational aspect, you've got this vocational side of the assessments as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that also meant that quite a few of the assessments were group based. And obviously, I had permission from one student, but if it's a group of 4 students and I've only got permission from one, it kind of meant that, again, I couldn't use that text. Those kind of essays and dissertations as well, the stuff that's kind of EAP bread and butter, if you like. And I know Arlene was talking about them being kind of dominant genres and whatever. They were less dominant in these areas, and I'll talk about that in a sec. And also that they focus much more on creative skills, sketches, designs. So they were, which is perfect for today's PIM, they were very multimodal, and they're also produced as part of different programs, so they weren't necessarily typed up on Word, they might be on Photoshop, and they're often PDFs. So this presented some issues in terms of linguistic analysis because of the multimodality, because I couldn't necessarily just throw them all in a corpus and let the corpus do its thing. And there's reasons why I didn't want to do that. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about the text and let you see some of them so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So we'll start off then with some of the more practitioner-based genres. So these are CVs. You'll see here that I've blanked out quite a lot because I didn't want any identifying stuff for the students because they've kindly let me look at their work. So as you can see, this is really multimodal, but it's very different in terms of layout as well. So the students are really, really encouraged to kind of showcase their individuality as well as their creative work and their images. And there's lots of options related to these. And this is part of a bigger module where they also produce a manifesto and a personal statement. And they're also then interviewed as part of this based on this CV and the other things that they submit. So very heavily influenced by the occupation again. There were some more kind of academic genres. The students were telling me that they had an essay. I looked at the essays and they looked like this, which didn't look like an essay I'd seen before. I found out later that they were actually illustrated essays. They had dropped the illustrated part, and they felt very much that they were academic in the beginning, but the more I was looking at them, and then the more I was looking at some of the literature around how architects write, they actually felt much more like an architecture magazine article. There were a lot of kind of, the layout was quite similar, the content was also quite similar. So actually maybe it's not the academic genre if it at first appears, maybe it's much more of a kind of practitioner genre, or pracademic, shall we say, kind of hybrid between the two. So the other one I wanted to talk about, which is kind of my main focus today, is the dissertations. So I've got 3 examples for you there, and I wondered if you'd like to add to the Padlet what your initial thoughts are from seeing those, what jumps out at you, anything interesting, different, things that you might be expecting. I'll see if I can pull the Padlet up. It's disappeared. I'll give you a sec to find it. There you go. Right, I think, yeah, I'm still sharing. It's a funny layout, yes. Yeah, funny layout. Words like a person, yeah, this part here, this kind of little, almost like a poem type thing. Yeah, definitely non-linear. Yeah. These are 3 separate ones, by the way, in case anybody's. Lots of creativity. Direct question, yeah, why should we care? Very, very direct then. Any others that people want to add? Okay. Different fonts, yeah, different fonts, different colors, very refreshing. Yeah, yeah, very, very different from what I was kind of expecting. Um, so these are 3 different ones, and of these particular ones, we did talk about, somebody mentioned being kind of rewarded are not rewarded for kind of normative sort of things. For this particular student, they were very much rewarded for their creativity within it and got a very good score. And one of the pieces of feedback was on their layout and how they use their layout to really share their message. So it's interesting that in some more normative areas that might be punished, but in others it's kind of rewarded, which I think is really interesting. So we've got quite a lot of things kind of going on. And one of the problems with this then is that they're PDFs, and as you can see, they're often in columns as well, and they're often really strange sizes. Like some of them are massive, some of them are tiny, some of them are landscape, some of them are portrait. This one down here was A3, but actually put like almost as a book, like 2 A4 pages. So when you then try and scoop all that information up and throw it in a corpus, it actually gets very confused. So I kind of had to rule out a lot of that. But in order to be able to look at the genre in more detail and do some analysis, I kind of got together some numerical data. Now, bearing in mind what I said about it being a PDF document, quite a few of those PDFs, when you're counting the words or when the uh, software is counting the words, sometimes it's not seeing the words as words, it's seeing them as pictures because the students might have made it in Photoshop, for example. Same with the P units or paragraphs. So take this with a little bit of a pinch of salt. This needs more verification and further research. But in general, the dissertations were around 5,000 words long. These are the words of the whole document from the start to the finish. And Nessie and Gardner said one of the key factors in it being a dissertation or a research report was that it kind of had an abstract, which most of them had, some of them didn't. They also had a list of figures. Interestingly, sometimes there's more figures than sources, which I think is quite interesting for a dissertation. I think we'd kind of expect many more sources than anything else. And lots of the other features that you kind of mentioned that were included there in the further pieces. Okay, so I'll move on then to the kind of macro structure. So some of them were more of a kind of conventional or traditional kind of IMRAD structure, but that's a lot less frequent. Actually, much more of them are more topic based, which is towards the end here. And then you've got this big chunk of people in the middle that kind of have introduction and conclusion, and then maybe 3 chapters in between. So sometimes that feels like, and Nessie and Gardner have talked about this, sometimes that feels like kind of a 5-paragraph essay, like a long essay. And that kind of also marries with the fact that some of them have a stated methodology and some of them don't. So some of those essays are only drawing on secondary data. So quite a few of these students aren't drawing on any primary data at all. They're kind of looking at that secondary data and doing in-depth analysis of images and all sorts of other things. So that's kind of where I got to. And then the next stage, which I'm currently working on now, is looking at those sections themselves, because obviously the students have named these sections, but actually looking at the features of those sections and trying to work out what the moves and steps are within those. So as part of that, though, which is why, again, I couldn't necessarily use a corpus for this, is what impact the images have within that. Because if there are so many images, maybe the images are part of these sections or identifying which section is which. So, for example, there are less images in the introduction and conclusion sections, for example. So this is where I'm working on at the moment, is kind of looking at the status of these images. So for example, there, if a status is unequal and the text is subordinate to the image, and this goes back to what Arlene was saying about the given and the new. So if it's in that kind of top left-hand corner, maybe we're saying that the image is more important based on the size and the positioning of that. Also, if there's lots and lots of references back to that image, so it keeps saying this image, this the background, and talking about the image in a lot of detail, that's kind of indicating that unequalness. This presents a problem for many reasons, but one of the reasons being that I can analyze the text in a corpus, and I can analyze the images in a separate software, but it's very difficult to analyze them both together. I've gone back now to NVivo to do that, and it seems to be doing what I want it to do. So, but it's a very long process, and it often shuts down without saving, which is interesting and
Jen,
helpful.
just
Yeah.
to let you know, you've got about a minute, okay?
Wonderful. Okay, I've got 2 slides left and then I'm done. Okay. So the next part, which we can talk about at another point, is interviews with the students. So I'm going to continue with the analysis and have interviews with the students and interviews with the academics to think about what are the reasoning behind some of these choices that the students have made. Is it direct instruction or is it influence from other texts? Which then brings me on to how the writing practices of the architecture industry might influence some of those students and those staff. So architecture magazines, architecture blogs. So maybe using the same methods of analysing the text to then analyse some of the architecture magazines and blogs and make some comparisons there. And those are my references. Thank you very much. I'll go back to kind of the start, just in case that's helpful to anyone. Thanks. Thank you. And I'll
That's
move you over
great.
here so I'm
That's
looking at you.
great. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I'm just going to stop the recording now, and then
Fab.
we can go to some questions. Okay.
Yeah, great.